Hey everyone, David Parsons here. Got a few quick thoughts I want to share about this book I just finished called Eminent Hipsters by Donald Fagen. Some of you may know that Donald Fagen is half of the band Steely Dan, the greatest band in history, maybe. Certainly one of the grooviest. And this book gives you a lot of ideas about where that comes from. This is not a straightforward Steely Dan memoir. This is more Donald Fagen sharing a few quick essays and ideas about the culture of the 1950s and 1960s that he grew up around and how all of that formed his personality and identity and certainly influenced his sort of aesthetic sense. You can sort of feel the pulse of Steely Dan coming in this book, even though Fagen is mostly talking about other things. I want to mention a couple things about why I think this book is so much fun. Number one, it should be maybe obvious. Donald Fagen is an incredible writer. He's just really funny, really sarcastic. You get his kind of cranky attitude, but also he's just really good at writing about culture. There's an essay in here about Ray Charles that's seriously like 3 paragraphs. It's an insanely short essay. And after I read it, I was like, wow, I've never really thought about Ray Charles that way. It kind of nailed it. I want to read the last paragraph of this Ray Charles piece. Because to me, all of this book sort of set me off in thinking about maybe some like typical boomer culture in a different way. But here's Donald Fagen on Ray Charles. Ray's soul revolution ran parallel to and interacted with the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s. In the more militant 70s, the funk of James Brown and Sly Stone took over to provide a more obvious soundtrack. Ray's attempts to jump on the funk wagon were half-hearted. The new black sound was colder and right up in your face, based in fact on a smaller division of the beat. James Brown, Isaac Hayes, and Barry White seemed less interested in pleasing a woman than in collecting body parts. In contrast, Ray's sage interpretation of America the Beautiful in 1972 was at once a taunt, a healing gesture, and a blind man's dream of the promised land. Perhaps a eulogy as well. Ray's work, even in decline, was always wiser and subtler than that of the new breed. It was music for adults. For me, though, and a generation of suburban boomers, Ray was the professor of desire, and Georgia on My Mind, square-ass backup singers and all, just may have been the most beautiful 3 minutes and 39 seconds in all of 20th century music. So after I read that piece, of course, obviously, the first thing I'm doing is going and listening to Georgia on My Mind and trying to hear what Donald Fagen is talking about. And there are so many rabbit holes like that. Ray Charles is obviously someone we all know, but one of the delights of this book is reading Donald Fagen's account of all these weird bits of mid-century culture that I had never really known much about. One of the things he mentions very early on are all these girl singing groups of the 1920s and 1930s. Specifically, though, the Boswell Sisters. I had never heard of the Boswell Sisters. I know I've mentioned kind of creepy girl singing groups of the 40s and 50s on this show before, specifically like the Cordettes or especially the Andrews Sisters during World War II. But these Boswell Sisters, I mean, what this did, and this happened throughout the whole book, is sent me running to the internet to kind of look this stuff up and listen to it. Because Connie Boswell in particular, who's kind of the focus of this piece that Fagen writes, is just an extraordinary vocal talent. And what you hear is, it's just kind of incredible music. What these girls did, what these young women did in New Orleans in the 1920s was sort of be saturated in black music. They're white women, but they blew everyone's minds because they took ideas and aesthetic kind of moves from jazz and brought them to white audiences through this insanely syncopated, crazy harmony. The way that they use their voices is magic, and it's unbelievable. And I never heard any of that stuff before. So it made me aware of the Boswell Sisters. There's a chapter that's about radio hosts like Gene Shepard. I didn't really know much about Gene Shepard. He's the guy that's probably most famous for us for making the movie A Christmas Story. But Gene Shepard is part of this whole world of like 1940s, 1950s radio hosts who are telling stories, reading poetry, and really like connecting with a young audience in these suburbs outside major cities like Chicago and New York. Donald Fagen really narrates how important these voices were, and it's hard not to think about like podcasting and radio and the human voice as a particularly powerful thing, especially when you're sort of like feeling alone, right? It's something you do by yourself. There's some great chapters about that stuff and sort of sci-fi, radio, War of the Worlds, that sort of stuff. And then he's also got a lot of pieces about jazz. And this was the stuff that really, really set me off. There's a piece about a place. He talks about clubs in Manhattan and kind of like taking the bus from New Jersey into Manhattan and going to these jazz clubs in the 1960s. And there's a whole lot of amazing stories, but the one that I'd never heard before, and I'm so grateful to have learned about, is Slug's Saloon, a bar that was only open for a few years in the late 60s and early 1970s. It was on 3rd Street between Avenue B and C, for those of you paying attention, in the far, far East Village. But Slug's Saloon, the way that Fagen describes this place, it's just sort of an incredible space for jazz. It was a really seedy, scary neighborhood. The place is probably, unfortunately, most known and most famous for the murder of Lee Morgan, who's a really famous and important trumpet player, who was murdered by his common-law wife in an argument that took place in the club and spilled out into the sidewalk, and he was shot on the sidewalk and died. So the piece of jazz history that Slug's Saloon represents is something I hadn't known, but the whole description of the kind of like village jazz scene, I know that's stuff that you maybe think you've heard before, but Donald Fagen has such an incredible set of takes on it. So check that piece out too. The jazz stuff was really, really helpful for me. It gave me a kind of flavor of jazz I hadn't really thought about before, even though I consider myself somewhat of a jazz guy. And finally, there is a little bit of Steely Dan in here, and I have to finish with this this bit of what happens when Donald meets Walter Becker at Bard College in the 1970s. Actually, it's 1967 when he meets Walter, and this moment for Steely Dan fans. This just explains so much. And this book, it might not be a Steely Dan memoir, but just these 2 paragraphs, this account of Walter and Donald meeting in college and starting to play music together sort of explained all of the Steely Dan mythology to me. So check this out. One afternoon in 1967, I walked over to the Red Balloon, a crummy little shack in the woods that served as an on-campus music club. As I approached, I could hear someone playing some electric blues guitar inside, just messing around. But this wasn't the trebly, surfadelic white guy sound I was used to hearing from other student guitarists. This fellow had an authentic blues touch and feel and a convincing vibrato. His amp was tweaked to produce a fat, mellow sound and turned up loud enough to generate a healthy Albert King-like sustain. Inside, playing a cranberry red Epiphone guitar, was a severe-looking, bespectacled kid who would turn out to be my partner and bandmate for the next 40 years. Walter Becker and I had many interests in common: jazz, blues, all sorts of popular music, Nabokov and the writers of what was then called the Black Humor School, science fiction, and so on. Walter shared an enormous room in Ward Manor with a dandyish wag by the name of Randall. Randall didn't seem to mind when Walter carted in 2 humongous Altec monitor speakers through which we blasted, for both pleasure and as a matter of professional interest, some of the great music of the time. We had very similar tastes, which ran from Miles Davis to the Mothers of Invention, whom we had both seen during their infamous run at the Garrick Theater on Bleecker Street. Walter hipped me to inspiring stuff both old, Howlin' Wolf, and new, Laura Nyro, for the first time. We started writing music and lyrics together, mostly on an upright piano in a small sitting room in the lobby of the manor. One of us would come up with some clowny idea, and we'd bounce it around until we were so convulsed with laughter that we'd have to quit. For whatever reason, the combination of the funky grooves, the jazz chords, and the sensibility of the lyrics, which seemed to fall somewhere between Tom Lehrer and Pale Fire, really cracked us up. Of course, at that point, what we were doing was pretty crude compared to some of our later efforts, but it was never less than fun. So I thought that was just a really sweet take on the formation of Steely Dan, and this entire book Eminent Hipsters by Donald Fagen. I highly recommend if you want to get a flavor, a kind of feeling of the real vibe of growing up in the 50s and 60s and how that comes into a certain kind of mind. I really enjoyed this book. I hope you do too. Check it out.